We still have two speakers remaining today, and I'd like to introduce the first one now, and that's Professor Kristy Muir. Kristy is the CEO of the Centre for Social Impact and a Professor of Social Policy at Sydney Business School. And we also have the delight to have Kristy on our Community Directors Council. Kristy is driven by a desire to better understand and find solutions to complex social problems and measure whether and where we're making a difference. She's also worked for almost 3 decades with for-purpose organisations. Kristy's research spans housing, education, employment, social participation, disability, mental health and financial resilience and wellbeing. She's published widely in a range of academic journals as well as publicly accessible and popular media such as TEDx, The Guardian and The Conversation. Today, Kristy's going to be talking about a topic very close to my own heart, her new Social Progress Index, which is used to measure if the environmental and social needs of citizens are being met. And I know this is a passion for most of you out there as well. Kristy's joining us from Sutherland Shire, I believe, in New South Wales, which is Dharawal country, I understand. Over to you, Kristy.
Good afternoon, everybody. Hope you're well. Let me acknowledge that I am sitting on Dharawal country and pay my respects to wherever you might be sitting around this country and acknowledge that it was, is and always will be Aboriginal land. Let me pay my respects to elders past and present and, of course, to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders who might be with us this afternoon. I wanted to say thanks for having me. Also acknowledge my colleague, Dr. Megan Weir, who's led this research for CSI on the Social Progress Index for Australia. And finally, thanks for being here, given Zoom fatigue that is hitting all of us at the moment. You're almost there to the end of the day, I understand it. I want to take you back, for those of you who are old enough, 30 years, and go back to 1991 in your minds. It was the year that Paul Keating challenged Bob Hawke, so we had 2 prime ministers during that time. It was the year, apparently, that the Honda Accord was the most popular car, certainly not in my household. And it was the year that Mr. Bean and The Simpsons debuted on Australian television. It was also the year that in Australia, there were over 257,000 babies born across the country. Let's call one of these babies Sam, who was born in Mount Druitt, and the other Andrew, who was born in North Sydney. By the time that Sam and Andrew were 2, the country was hit by an economic downturn, leaving around 1 in 10 families with children living in jobless households. Andrew's parents weren't affected, Sam's family was. These kids are now 29 years of age. They're almost at their 30th birthday. In their first 28 years of their life, Australia experienced unprecedented economic growth. In fact, by the time they were 25, average household disposable incomes was actually twice that of when they were born, even after accounting for price rate rises and population growth. So by any measure, those 28 years of unprecedented economic growth is a remarkable outcome. But is this enough to measure Australia's social progress? If we stay with Andrew and Sam's stories, irrespective of the fact that they both grew up during these 28 years of economic growth, we could then, as we still can now, predict somebody's life outcomes of those babies and others based on the postcode in which they were born. We can predict their education, their employment, their income, and their health outcomes, amongst other things. Sam has a low education level, spent many years underemployed, is now unemployed, is in housing stress, and skips meals to feed his kids. Andrew has a higher education, is full-time employed, and lives at home in a high-income household where he's saving for a deposit for his own place. And based on current data, is more likely to actually be a CEO because his name is Andrew than if he was a woman by any other given name, for those of you who like those kinds of stats. Over almost 3 decades of their lives, we as a country became richer than we ever could have imagined. But even before COVID, growth was not good for everybody. Sam wasn't the only one who grew up in poverty, and despite this economic growth, we failed to address many social issue areas pre-COVID. Let's have a look at some of them. On the financial stress front, around 1 in 10 adults and 1 in 7 kids were living in poverty. Wage growth did not keep up with inflation. Almost 1 in 4 who are working don't have access to any paid leave entitlements. We know financial stress in general is high. We know that among low-income households, housing stress is exceptionally high. Across the country, 1 in 200 are homeless on any given night. It's double the rate for our young people. And food insecurity is incredibly high, especially amongst our most disadvantaged households. We still have a fundamental problem with digital exclusion, with around 2.5 million Australians missing out. We have problems with family and domestic violence, as many of you will well know, and around 1 in 5 people experience mental health disorders or a disability, and we know that that has implications for their educational outcomes, their employment, and their participation more broadly. So what this tells us is that we've failed as a country to actually progress beyond that GDP marker. And we need a new way to be able to determine the extent to which we can progress socially. So what we wanted to do is to look at, well, how do we come up with an index to measure social progress? And social progress is all about, by definition, the capacity to meet basic human needs, to enhance and sustain people's quality of lives, and to ensure that all people can reach their full potential. The Social Progress Index is an index that enables us to measure these 3 things in aggregate. It's a global measure based against these 3 domains of human needs, foundations of wellbeing, and opportunity. And our premise is, if we can marry up the GDP or the economic side of it with the social progress imperative, then we're going to get inclusive growth. The Social Progress Initiative Index is based on universally important questions. It's that international framework that asks big picture questions against things like, do people have adequate housing with basic utilities? It asks questions like, do people have access to an education foundation? Can people freely access ideas and information from anywhere in the world? And are people free to make their own life choices? In understanding the extent to which different countries meet these definitions, we need to be able to select indicators that tell us to what extent the country is performing against each of these things. When we looked at doing this, we had to come up with some universal design principles that were important. 4 key things were critical to the development of this. They had to be exclusively social and environmental indicators. We wanted to make sure we were looking at outcomes and not inputs. We wanted to make sure that they were relevant to all states and territories, so we could come up with state and territory comparisons. And we wanted things that were actionable. So the research needs to be something that we can see how we're progressing, we can respond with policies, interventions, programs, etc., and hopefully see the changes as a result of those at a macro level. I'm not going to spend time on this. There's heaps of background information on our website. You're free to contact Megan Muir if you want all the methodological background. But we also looked at a whole lot of things in selecting those indicators around data availability, granularity, comparison at state and territory levels, sample sizes, reliability, transparency, etc. Where we were limited was in areas particularly around things like environmental indicators and irregular collection of social indicators. And also we were really challenged by the deficit approach that's been taken to understand Indigenous indicators. But that's enough methodologically. You can find out more information if you're interested on that from Megan or our website. But here's where we landed. So despite those 3 decades of economic growth that I was talking about, Australia's Social Progress Index does not look particularly great. We don't fare that well. You can see that what we've done here is we've scored different states and territories. It shows how those states and territories are performing relative to each other. We looked at 2015 to 2018 so we could compare trends over time. And we saw some consistent things. The ACT will be no surprise to anybody, performed number 1 in each of those years. Western Australia and the Northern Territory consistently placed 7th and 8th. The order and scores of some of these states and territories on social progress might seem surprising, or it might make complete sense to you. And I think where it can be helpful across Australia is where we're doing well and where we need improvement. And it's when we start to look within states and territories or within particular areas within the index that we can see where the attention is most needed. So let's have a look at one of these areas, which is nutritional and basic medical care. Australia actually performs really well in this area, with the exception of the Northern Territory. When we look at the indicators that are used to create this component, factors such as remoteness, the high proportion of residents who are Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander can help to explain this disparity we're seeing between the Northern Territory and other states and territories around the country. If we look at other areas, let's take personal freedom and choice, for example, there is more disparity around how the states and territories are faring in these kinds of issues. And this was the area where we saw across the country there was most need for improvement. And these are issues like things like inclusiveness and personal freedom and choice. They're more complex than, say, nutrition and basic medical care, because it's less about how much money you have to spend on improving an issue and more about the social context that exists for the people within that community, the extent to which they feel they have personal rights, freedom of choice, and feelings of inclusiveness or belonging. There are also issues which, these are issues that a whole lot of us in the not-for-profit, for-purpose sector are trying to improve within communities. And what our hope is that the Social Progress Index could be picked up as a language and a framework that we can use to help improve things like opportunity across the board. We can also take the Social Progress Index, and you can play with this online. It's completely usable for you to move around. And we can also look at it at a state or territory level and bring up these sort of detailed scorecards within each of the areas to show how each state and territory is performing. And you can pick over which particular time point for this. You'll remember that I said ACT consistently ranks number 1, but you can see from this is that they certainly have areas that they could do with some significant improvement. They perform really well in certain areas, but they're slower on things like personal freedom and choice, inclusiveness, and environmental quality. I think what's good about this at a state and territory level is different groups or individuals, policymakers can pick it up and say, where does the state or territory actually need the most support to lift the social progress as a whole? It's quite a powerful tool. We've also produced these state-by-state scorecards, which is a more simple way of looking at how the state and or the territories are performing almost off a traffic light system. Victoria ranked 4th overall across all the states and territories, and you can see where they're performing well against the green dots, mediocre in the yellow and need for improvement, and quite poorly in the orange and red categories. I think if you think about this in aggregate, what this helps show us is that as a total, they do good and bad in some areas, but actually overall, they're still only ranking 4th. And to really lift the social progress of a state or territory or the country overall, we really need to focus on multiple components at once. The Social Progress Index can also be mapped against the SDGs. For those of you who are interested in the Sustainable Development Index, we have done scorecards mapping the SPI framework to the 17 SDGs and seeing how states and territories are doing against these particular goals. One of the key things here is that some of them are less robust than others because we're only able to find 1 or 2 quality indicators. But nonetheless, what is still really interesting about this is where SDGs are a driving force, and particularly in Australia where we've struggled to report against this, we can see how we're faring either at a state and territory level or nationally by looking at how Australia is doing against the SDGs based on the Social Progress Index. And I've just given you the example of Queensland just to have a look at how this might work, as opposed to expecting you to be able to read that tiny text and take on any of that information. The other thing that we wanted to do was to be able to track trends over time. And this is really important, not just for the first lot of the SPI in Australia. And by the way, we're one of 45 countries that have done this at a very specific level. Globally, we rank around 12th out of 139 countries. The trends piece is important because if we're going to actually hopefully have this as an iterative, let's develop new policies and programs and investments based on where we need to lift our social progress, we want to see those trends improve over time. And we actually have seen improvement between 2015 and 2018 across the states and the territories. The interesting thing about the small improvements is we could look at these small improvements and we could hypothesize that, well, maybe the economic growth was in relation to an improvement in social progress. Maybe as these states and territories have improved in terms of their economic trajectories, they've invested in these things, and this is why we're seeing improvements with some of these trends being on the up. We actually tested this, and unfortunately what we didn't see was this. So our hypothesis being that as the Social Progress Index score goes up and the GDP per capita goes up, our hypothesis is that technically or rationally, it should look something like this, the graph. But actually, when we looked at this and we modeled it against the GSP, that's the per capita gross state or territory domestic product, it didn't look like this, but rather like this. So what this is showing us is that economic growth is not currently correlating with social progress. And interestingly, when we look at states with some of the highest state gross per capita, the economic outcomes for Western Australia and Northern Territory were highest across all of the states and territories over this time period, and yet they performed 7th and 8th in the list compared to other states and territories. The other thing that we can look at is whether it does or doesn't reflect individual economic realities. And this is where we have seen, we know it doesn't reflect economic realities at a state and territory level. When we look at an individual level, we're seeing a closer alignment when we take the median. So what this is telling us is there's a story of inequality. So when we get the median level of income, we're starting to see some closer alignment between the social progress and the economic outcomes. And the real question here as states and territories and as a nation is, how do we start to shift this for the country as a whole? And how do we start to shift this relationship we're seeing to address that story of inequality? We can also take the SPI framework and say, well, how are we going when we apply the policy analysis to what's happened? We can take COVID, for example. Now, this isn't everything that ever existed in the life of the policy response to COVID. But what it does do is start to show you where the responses were from different government departments and in different social issue areas during the COVID period. And I think when we start to put a dollar value against some of these in the federal government response, and again, we can do it by state and territories, we can see sort of the dominant response being an economic one in terms of COVID, with some responses being around health in particular, not surprising, some funding going into communications packages, and broadly, again, around health and well-being. And similarly, we could map that at each state and territory level. And my colleague, Muir, and a couple of other colleagues have been talking to various MPs around the country in regard to how their states and territories are faring and also their responses. From a big picture level, I think we need to start thinking about where we came from when you go back to 1991 and we look at where we were before COVID to post-COVID. And I'd argue that weathering the storm is not enough during COVID in terms of our policy responses because our social progress was so inadequate to start with. And if we're serious about economic recovery, we're going to have to focus not just on the important economic pieces to the puzzle, but the other pieces that enable people to maintain jobs, community connections, supports, affordable and social housing, and responsive healthcare. And we've started to see this over the weekend with the announcement of social housing investment in Victoria, and hopefully we'll start to see that in some other areas as well. Our hypothesis is that we will only see resilience and recovery if we can address the economic and the social progress. And I'm not going to go over this because I've wasted time on the internet crashing at the start, but we've seen significant effects of the impact, the economic impact of COVID, and then we've also seen significant impacts of the societal effects of COVID, and those are going to get worse. And really the point of that is that what we're likely to see is an exacerbation of the social and economic issues that we saw pre-COVID with the Social Progress Index results. It's likely to get worse. And hopefully with some of the policy and other responses that we're seeing at local and federal levels, we'll be mitigating some of that shift. The key thing really in the big picture is we want the Social Progress Index for Australia to help identify what's working, in what locations, and at that macro level, what might need attention, where we need to increase collaboration across the sectors in terms of how we might respond to the problems that we're seeing. And as a result, where we want to land is really good, inclusive, socially progressive growth. And really the wash up of all of this is back to that whole piece that the postcode in which you were born should not predict your life outcomes. And we hope that something like the Social Progress Index can help lift states and territories across the country as well as the country as a whole. Thanks.
Thank you very much for that really, really interesting presentation. I've got a number of questions that I'm going to go through now. The first question is from Alana Story from West Wimmera Health Service, and she asks, is there any plan to reduce the geographical area of the tool, for example, by LGA? And I know you talked about individual level, but do you have something like LGA level data?
We're really keen to do it. We've started to talk to various MPs about that. We would love to be able to do it by LGA or at a council level. Yes, and the key here is just resourcing. So if we can get that resource, we would absolutely do it by LGA. In terms of in some LGAs, we maybe have some limited restrictions based on thresholds for the indicators and sample sizes, but absolutely this could be done at an LGA level. And I think that's where we'd start to see real power in change, particularly where you're seeing collective efforts like those kinds of health services collaborating with other locals in communities, and you're seeing cross-sector investment in the community to get change. That would be really interesting.
Fantastic. I'd love to see that. So we have from Bambi from Neighbourhood Watch Victoria. When was the data collected? Bambi would like to know, and she's interested to see that Victoria is low for personal freedom. Anything to do with the COVID lockdown?
It wasn't to do with the COVID lockdown because the data was collected before that. So we waited till the end of 2018. Can you hear me, Kathy? My internet's scratchy at mine. Okay, good.
You're loud and clear here.
Excellent. We waited till the end of 2018 and analysed the data in throughout 2019. We had to wait for all of that data to be available, because part of that, data might finish being collected in 2018, but actually, for example, people know, with ABS census data as an easy example, it takes time for them to clean it up and make it available. So it's based on 2018 data. We'll be looking at the 2019 data as soon as it's all sort of fully available. So I hopefully get started on that, and then we'll be able to add 2020. And so I think that the tricky thing is it doesn't include COVID, but in due course it will. And there's enough we can tell by the trends. The interesting thing about the Victorian lockdown piece is that actually, if you put that in where the response goes in that piece around personal opportunities, then actually what we've seen is that that those on-the-spot fines for breaching public health orders for lockdown of the social housing towers in Melbourne would detract from that score in due course. So the question is actually right in that, yes, we would see that in future, but actually these results were showing up before then. I think that's one of the alarming things about the results is how poorly we were doing in some areas pre-COVID, which isn't surprising for those who followed economic trends.
Which leads me to the next question, and I don't know if you're able to speculate on this, but how do you expect the effects of COVID to play out on, where the states sit?
Different states and territories have had different responses to COVID. When you look at that, I briefly showed the New South Wales example, and you can, New South Wales basically put in money into investing in ICU expansion, a whole lot of health things. There was like stimuluses around all sorts of things to do with basic human needs. We saw across most states and territories an investment in temporary accommodation for people who were homeless during that period. The big challenge with that particular example, and that all fits under the domain of that basic human needs, the challenge with the social housing example is that in Australia, we have around 200,000 people on our wait list for social housing. It's about a 10-year wait. So the problem with that is that although that the immediacy of COVID would have helped during that period where people were given temporary housing, there's nowhere to go. And so that's really where we're going to start to see struggle. Different states and territories invested differently across the human needs, foundations of wellbeing and opportunity, but where we see most investment is in that area of the economic kind of recovery piece. Interestingly, though, I think Victoria will actually do really quite well in due course, eventually in the future, through investment in things like social housing, which we know will be a boost more broadly. I think the other thing that we can say about the impact of COVID is that we have seen increased mental health issues. We have seen mental health issues affect families who have the lowest of incomes worse in terms of the data we're seeing. Of great concern is that suicide modelling has predicted around a 14% increase, which is pretty frightening. And we've seen sort of profound implications on social and health implications of how we kind of all work and play and interact. And there are, sorry, my puppies are barking. I'm just giving you a real life example of how our work and play has changed fundamentally. But there are some positive things. So, for example, what we've seen during COVID, because of the economic investment in social security, we have seen less people reporting skipping meals because of a lack of not having enough money to eat. I think where we're going to get in trouble is the cliff edge come March, because not only are we going to see a decrease in social security payments, but we've also got 3 million people protected on JobKeeper at the moment.
Yeah, and job seeker as well, raise the rate hashtag.
Yeah, that's right.
So still on COVID, someone had a question here about, I'll just find the exact question so I'm not putting words into your mouth. I think a lot of people, this is Antoinette from Wyndham City Council, I think a lot of people did not realise that they lived in poverty until COVID-19 brought that to the forefront. So a lot of people, I think that's referring to some precarious employment and all sorts of things. What are your thoughts on this? And she says that poverty is sometimes to do with your postcode.
Yeah, it's such an interesting observation, and I think she's right. I think there isn't always a realization of that because you're so busy just trying to survive day to day that it's not something that's always thought about. In terms of the poverty piece, I think people who are living on very, very low incomes, we'll talk about and constantly talk. Kathy, you mentioned raise the rate, such a challenge because the social security rates below the poverty line means that, it doesn't matter how much financial literacy you teach someone. If you've only got $50 and you've got to pay the bills and buy your kids food, you've still only got $50. And so the poverty rate is a very serious problem in this country. When we look internationally at how you address complex social problems, and you look at a whole lot of evidence across the world and all sorts of different things, the thing that comes up time and time and time again is giving people adequate incomes to make sure that they can maintain those sort of levels of living. And interestingly, to that piece around some people don't know they're in poverty, the other one that gets missed is that often people just think the only people in poverty are those who don't have jobs, who are unemployed. And that's certainly the case. But actually, when you look at the poverty statistics in Australia, 1 in 3 people in poverty are actually working. So we also have, it's talked about in America, but in Australia, we also have the working poor, which is where the underemployed numbers come into account, and also where those precarious workers come into account that you're talking about, Kathy.
I've got a question here from Fiona Dempster from Mulaney. I think both Kristy and Peter have made the case, she says, yet again, for place-based interventions and local and regional responses. When will governments get on board, I wonder? Do you have any reflection on that?
Oh, look, it's a great observation. And the place-based interventions, we've seen some getting on board in particular issue areas or around particular age groups. But she's absolutely right. It's the key thing around how do we build actually strong, resilient communities. And I think the interesting thing when we look at the language that's being used at the moment, and let's add in the bushfires, right? So we have we had floods as well, but we had bushfire crisis early in 2020, then COVID. And what the two have collectively shown is the importance of place and what place actually means for how people live and function and the kinds of supports and interventions that we can put in place. And interestingly, the government, including the bushfire recovery groups, are all talking about resilience. And the piece that I always talk about resilience is that often it is completely misdefined in that people think about resilience being about individuals. And resilience is not just about individuals. It's about individuals and their ability to draw on external resources. And so that's where the sense of place comes in, because actually the infrastructure that wraps around you, and you think about your families and your peers and your acquaintances that are in your immediate surroundings, are absolutely critical to the extent to which you do or don't thrive, whether you're a little baby, a child, or even an adult or an older person. And so I think that point about how do we invest in place-based in place, governments invest in place-based is really important. And it also reinforces that actually this isn't an individualistic piece. And if we have the art of connecting the me to the we, and around that sense of place and what infrastructure could look like with that wraparound social capital support, then we're going to change the world, I think. So she's wise.
Hooray for that. And I know I've never felt so sort of local and locally embedded in the communities that I live in as in the last sort of 7 months or so. I've got a kind of a technical question here from Anthony from Wyndham Council. Does this cross over with the Happy Planet Index and most livable cities type measurements? So I guess that's a question about, you talked about the SDGs map. Does it map to other things?
I'd have to take that one on notice. I don't know about the Happy Planets. Megan, my colleague, might, but I can take a note on that. I'm not sure, but it could map to other things. I mean, the Social Progress Index, because it is global, is against those three kind of key things. And those three domains are all about what does it take to create the kind of society that everybody wants to live in and to function and thrive around what that social progress actually means. So the social development goals actually do line up because they're quite similar in that these are the kinds of things that as a society we all aspire to achieve for the kind of world we want to live in. And so it wasn't really any surprising, even though the SDGs, it wasn't surprising that the SDGs and the SPIs can marry up quite closely. So if the Happy Planets piece also fits under that kind of methodology, then it's likely it would, but I'd have to take that on notice.
I was really interested to see your graph that you expected to go this way with economic and went the other way. Do you have any comment about that? Is that we've at this conference explored over the years the notion of equality, and when the gap between rich and poor gets too wide, that's when the wheels start to fall off. Do you think there's something of that in this, those findings?
Yeah, absolutely. And to be honest, I did the hypothesis thing with the graph, but cheekily, I honestly did not expect that hypothesis to come true because of all that work that's happened on inequality. And when we look at that, when you look at that last 28 years of economic growth that we had before COVID, Australia was the envy of the world, but our inequality numbers were not good and had continued to grow. And when we look at that conversation about what inequality means at that GDP level, other, economists have demonstrated really well what that means for society as a whole. So Nobel Peace Prize winner Joseph Stiglitz, some of the audience may know Joseph's work, he demonstrated that the greater that gap between the richest and poorest, the worse the economy fares overall. So I thought there might be some correlation as a result of that, but because of the inequality, it doesn't surprise me. So maybe the different question to ask is, how much better would economic growth be if actually we could close that economic gap? And then there are also like really strongly associated economic links where things like, Productivity Commission has done really great work around the cost of mental illness and suicide and how much it costs us per day. There's some really great work that's been done by CoLab on early intervention services for kids and our young people. And because we don't do early intervention in mental health and youth and out-of-home care and things like that, it's estimated to be costing taxpayers around $15.2 billion every year. So there's been lots of work on the links between the costs of not dealing with these social issues economically, but less so about connecting the economics to the social progress piece, which is where we want to start to see the shift, because we think that actually the economy matters enormously. So let's marry up the economic progress with the social progress for that piece around inclusive growth.
That leads really well into a question from Jocelyn Horton-Smith, who asks, how are governments accessing this data, and do governments/politicians, which I think is possibly a more interesting word to use, trust the data? And I would add, do they act on data?
Well, the act on is really is the key, right? But the trusting is important to get to the acting on. So, this data is actually really quite rigorous. We've been quite, we spent a ridiculously long time getting rid of data that was not rigorous and cleaning up and making sure that indicators married up to the frameworks and met all sorts of rules. In terms of governments, we actually, before COVID, we were lucky enough to launch this in Parliament House at the invitation of amazingly, MPs from the Greens. So we had Andrew Lee, Adam Bant, and I've had a memory block, Greens, Liberal, and one of the Labor MPs who came to the session when we launched this and talked to them through the Social Progress Index at a national level. And since then, we did have a roadshow plan where we were going to physically do it, but we've since then been doing Zoom calls with state and territory MPs in different states and territories to inform them about how they're going as a state and territory, and to talk about how this can be used to understand how they're tracking, to think about where priorities might be focused and how they can lift, and what it will mean to then be able to track what's happening over time. Because the challenge we've had in the past is we've never had this macro ability to measure. People talk about it all the time. Wouldn't it be great if we had an index where we could measure our social progress? We haven't been able to do that historically. So what we're hoping is this gives those policymakers, as well as other people looking to invest in social issue areas in different geographic locations, data and rigorous evidence to better inform that. And then at a macro level, see whether they're making any difference. Because who's holding them to account? That's a question for you, Kathy.
Yeah. Well, I'd put it back to you. Like, who is holding them to account? And are the people at this conference, do they have a role to play in taking the work that you're doing and providing the evidence and providing a framework for us to measure our progress in seeing some action taken to start shifting the dial?
Yeah, look, at CSI, we have our common mantra is everyone plays a role. And we're all part of that system, and we all have agency around how we might inform this. And I think what the Social Progress Index does, and it's why we've invested so heavily through the Amplify Social Impact project, you can go online and you can play with all of this. It's not just a stagnant report. As stagnant as my presentation might have been, you can actually get online and tweak it. And I didn't do an online version just because we were worried about internet stability, which was probably just as well, right? Given the start. But you can play around with it. You can pick different states and territories. And if we all started to use this kind of nomenclature, we started to use the data and talked about our social progress and then picked up examples, people can print out the scorecards, see which areas need more investing in, use it as evidence to ask for grant funding or other things in their particular area, or invest if you're a philanthropist, for example.
To use it to demonstrate the need. I think we've got time for one more question. And this one comes from Antoinette, and she asks, does qualitative or quantitative data count more in community development, and how do you measure these things? And she adds, numbers, quantitative data, don't really reflect communities and the impact of the different communities. Qualitative data does not really show the trends as it's continually changing. How do you answer that?
Good question, Antoinette. It's why I've long been a mixed method researcher. We need both. Having the quantitative data will give you the power of the numbers, and the qualitative data will tell you the why and put the heart into why it matters and for who and under what circumstances. And it's why also the economic data matters, as well as the social progress. And where I've seen the most power in influencing fundamental policy change or other kind of big shifts is where we've been able to marry up the social implications of something from a stats perspective, the economic argument, as well as a human story. And what does this mean for someone's child or someone's life, or our families or communities? That's where the power of change is. And it's why some communities fare really well in terms of that bigger picture question about, well, how do we recover as a collective?
Kristy, thank you so much. That was an incredible presentation, and I know at our community we wish you great success with the Social Progress Index, and I'm sure everyone at the conference does as well. Thanks.
Thanks, Kathy. Thanks for having me, and I hope you all enjoy the rest of the conference.